Hi,
All right.
everyone. Great to see you all. Thank you all for being here. So today's session is really a celebration of the second edition of the Handbook of Arts-Based Research, but truly to me, it's a celebration of arts-based research. And yes, the book. And I want to say, at this moment, when in the United States and many other places, the arts, artists, education, free speech, freedom of expression are all under attack, this feels like an important moment to celebrate the work of artists and artist academics. And so I really appreciate everybody being here. And it is meant to be fun and celebratory, but I can't help but to feel at this moment when artists and academics are facing unprecedented challenges, that this is an important moment for us from around the world to come together to celebrate the arts. And it's one of the reasons that I wanted the event recorded and that it will be available online for others to participate if they choose to. So what we're planning to do is each of the four panelists are going to take some time to talk about their work and their chapters in the handbook. And then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So hopefully a fun discussion, questions, comments, whatever people want to talk about. So I'm going to be beginning, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of the Handbook of Arts-Based Research before I talk a little about my own work in fiction, which is what one of my chapters is about. So, I mean, I'm sort of the lucky one because I know the entire history, obviously, of this book and putting it together. And it really started 20 years ago. So before we get to the second edition of the Handbook of Arts-Based Research, we have to go back 20 years to when I had the idea to write my book, Method Meets Art, which is really how eventually the handbook came to be. And this is the first edition of Method Meets Art. I had to go through all my old bookshelves to find all the different editions for this talk, which was actually great fun. This is the first edition. I started writing it 20 years ago, and it originally came out in 2008. And I want to pay tribute today to all the cover artists who have contributed to all the books. So this piece, which is called Doll Cake, was created by a visual artist, Mary Jean Viano Crow. And I will tell you a little bit more about that art in a moment. So I just recently, by absolute fluke, had to write something about the time when I decided to write and publish Method Meets Art. And so I've just decided to read you an excerpt of what I wrote. This was 20 years ago, and I had sort of discovered that arts-based research is something that exists in the world, and it immediately made sense to me using the arts to communicate and to conduct social research. So I was immediately fascinated, and I started dabbling. I started with poetry and turning my interview research into poems. And then this happened. The more I read and explored, the more confused I was as to why there was no research methods book about arts-based research. There was one wonderful book published in 1998 by creative arts therapist Sean McNiff, a book I would recommend to this day. However, it was not a methods text. How were people supposed to learn how to do ABR without guidance? How was this approach to research going to gain legitimacy? Maybe I should write a research methods book about arts-based research. This was an aha moment. At this point, I had already co-authored and co-edited multiple research methods books. I was a whiz at literature reviews, enjoyed the writing process, and had learned a lot of valuable things about writing successful textbooks. Lessons partly learned from making numerous mistakes. Add to this, I had relationships with several well-respected research methods publishers. Despite my resume and belief that a book like this was desperately needed, I was filled with doubts. Not about the idea for the book, but my ability to do it. I had only been reading about and practicing ABR for a couple of years. I knew I was inexperienced and definitely not an expert. Yet I had the drive and determination to do it. Would that be enough? Experience has shown me there's no better way to learn about a subject than to write about it. Besides, maybe a novice would see the literature through fresh eyes. It was clear to me from looking at where many ABR practitioners went to school and taught that some were colleagues and friends. I didn't know any of them personally. Like so many times in my life, I was an outsider admiring them from afar. Sometimes outsiders see things differently and can discern both the trees and the forest. Besides, I was pretty good at being strategic. That skill got me far in my career. Surely it would take some strategy to write and market a book about a new approach to research, to legitimate a new way of knowing to the broader research community. Maybe what I lacked in experience, I made up for in passion, grit, and marketing savvy. So I decided to write a book proposal for a book called Method Meets Art, Arts-Based Research Practice. Getting support for a methods book about ABR was not easy. My mentor poo-pooed the idea. Anyone I mentioned it to looked at me like I was crazy, insisting, quote, ABR is not a thing, we don't need a book about that, and it's a fad, end quote. There was one person who believed in the idea from the start, my editor, C. Deborah Lawton. And I just want to say I'm so sorry that she's not here today, but she's finishing up the AERA conference where they had a poster celebrating our new handbook. So she's still working hard 20 years later for ABR, which is why she can't join us right now. C. Deborah worked with me to extensively reshape and revise the proposal, and she pitched the book to the owners of Guilford Press. They rejected it. To C. Deborah's credit, she persisted. She pitched the proposal over and over again, even laying her job on the line. It's rare to find such a champion for your work, especially rooms you're not in. When you find these people, treasure them. Eventually, Guilford Press offered me a contract, and a good one at that. Tip: sometimes a rejection from a publisher is a first offer. I've learned this lesson many times. I will say I've also learned the value of persistence. It took 1.5 years to get that book contract, but I knew this was the right publisher and the right path, and I truly, truly believed in the book. To write the book, I immersed myself in the literature. To this day, I'm often able to rattle off citations I first read 2 decades ago. People are often impressed by this skill, but really, it's merely a reflection of how much effort I put into that book. I compensated for my lack of expertise by learning as much as I could. I wrote the first draft by hand using a blue pen in a black moleskin notebook. My daughter was around 6 years old at the time and was taking art classes at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Much of Method Meets Art was drafted in the cafeteria of the museum while I waited for her. I think being in a building that houses so much art fueled the process. So this process really did begin 20 years ago and resulted in Method Meets Art, which came out in 2008. Much to my surprise, and definitely the surprise of the publishers and everyone else, it became my first bestseller. And I just want to say it's such a lesson in perseverance and tuning out the doubters and following your vision and finding the right people who will support that vision. Because it was 1.5 years of no's. It was 1.5 years of people I respected saying, this is not a good idea. And I had very low expectations about this book. And to this day, I must say, I'm actually shocked by what this book did. Now, of course, when it came out, it became a bestseller. And a lot of people thought, oh, wow, she got really lucky. Like she put that out and got lucky. Method Meets Art was my 7th book. So there was a lot of work for many years before this book came out. And I do want to go back to the cover art because I have so much respect for visual artists, and this piece, Doll Cake by Mary Jean Viano-Crowe. She made this artwork, which is a huge collage, a painted collage. The real painting is over 6 feet tall and is actually in my hallway. And I wish I could like bring the computer out to show you. It's enormous. I mean, it's bigger than I am. We had to get a special truck just to get it to our house and get it in our house. It's an artwork that she made based on a birthday cake her mother made for her when she was a girl in the 1950s. And I had to fight like hell, and C. Deborah had to fight like hell to get this art on the cover. I love Guilford Press. I worked with them for almost 20 years. I truly love these people. I still work with them. But back at that time, all their covers were basically beige or brown. The owners of Guilford Press, Seymour and Bob, who recently passed away, who are my mentors and I love and respect dearly. If you ever meet Seymour and if you ever met Bob, you'll know that they would be wearing like brown corduroy pants with a beige top, and they thought their books should look the same. And I came in with a book about art, and I wanted art that stood out on the cover. And we fought for this. And sometimes I don't fight hard for the things I want because there are other battles. So I let people, this one I fought for. And when I met the cover designer at Guilford many, many years later, he gave me such a big hug. I thought he was going to break my back. And he told me that I've always been his favorite author because this book changed the way they did covers and made his job a lot more fun and a lot more artistic. And I do want to say that one of the reviewers who wrote a multi-paragraph review of the book that helped make this book successful wrote an entire paragraph about the cover art, which I was sure to show the owners of Guilford Press to let them know they made the right decision allowing us to have this cover art. And it will also say that in the early days of book signings, when nobody showed up to the book signings for this book, which it doesn't matter if no one shows up, having the book signing matters because then there's a poster of your book and lots of copies that are prominently displayed. I learned very early in my career, you show up to your book signings, whether or not people do, it doesn't matter. The book might ultimately sell out anyway, just not during your signing. But my editor told me time and again that the conference manager told them at every conference, this book brought people into the booth to look at other books because of the cover art. So sometimes it's worth fighting for things like that. And I'm very grateful to the artist who gave me this book, cover art. And that book did well, which resulted in the second edition of Method Meets Art, which came out in 2015. And this cover art is by Joya Chilton, who is a creative arts therapist and a friend of mine. And she ultimately became a contributor for the handbook, which we'll be talking about. So this edition was even more successful than the first edition, which tends to happen if you have a book that does well, later editions do better. And that was the case with this. And this edition was translated into different languages all around the world, and just took arts-based research and me along with it to a very different place. And it was at the time when this book came out that Deborah and I both thought there should be a handbook of arts-based research. And at that time, we didn't have to fight for a contract because the owners of Guilford Press saw our vision very differently. And so that resulted in the first edition of the Handbook of Arts-Based Research, which came out in 2018. And many people in this room right now were contributors to the handbook, which is amazing. This cover art, I just want to say, I had the idea that whatever the art was, that the entire book would feel like wrapped in the art. That was my idea. It would be like a gift that was wrapped in art. And I really, really wanted to find a public artist, a street artist, a graffiti artist, someone who makes art that is outside of the museums and the art galleries. It might be in them too, but it is also outside. That felt important to me. I'm a big believer in public art. And I have a lot of questions about the art that is in art galleries and museums versus what is out in the street and is excluded from those spaces. And actually by fluke, because the New York Times didn't know we were going to have this session today, but the New York Times ran an article just a day or two ago about how the contemporary art we're seeing in museums now is all being fed through a few galleries, one in particular, and how there's this system that's funneling. And it's so funny, a week ago, I was in New York and I went to the Whitney Museum and saw a wonderful exhibit, and then found out this weekend when the New York Times ran this article that that artist is represented by this one gallery that is now feeding the museums. Anyway, interesting article for those who might be interested and want to check it out, but it speaks to the point why I wanted to look for an artist that might be excluded from that system and be outside of that system. And so before the handbook came out, I was in New York, walking around Soho, which is one of my favorite neighborhoods, very artistic neighborhood, and it was warm weather out, so there were lots of street artists outside selling their work. And I saw a street artist, and I fell in love with his work like immediately. I think he probably thought I was a crazy person because I started like blathering on to him about everything I think about his work and other artists. And, I'm sure he was completely overwhelmed by me. I bought a couple of pieces, and then I went home and looked him up and sent him an email and said, I'm actually an author. I write about the arts. I told him a couple of books that I've written. I said, if you want to look me up, I promise I'm legitimate. And I would really love to use your art for the cover of the handbook. And so we did. So we got a piece of his, and you can see the piece. It's hard to see through this, but it looks like cement. Like it looks like the street itself with cracks, and it looks or like a wall outside the street. So it's by a street artist, and it looks to me like literally art that is made on the street. And we actually filmed it to make a little darker. The piece is much lighter, but we wanted to make it look more cement. And this artist, he goes by the working name of Charlie Green, and you can look him up and follow him on Instagram or Facebook if you're interested. But that was how the first edition came to be. And then fast forward, that was successful. And so there was a third edition of Method Meets Art, which this was actually my most fun one to write, just for those who may be interested in that. There's something about writing this one, which just came out a couple of years ago, where I really reflected that so much had happened in the nearly 20 years since I had the idea for the first edition and this book, that it just felt like a joy. It was like a victory lap, not for me, but for arts-based researchers. Like writing this, when I wrote the first edition of this book, it was really hard to find examples for some of the chapters. A lot of people didn't call their work arts-based research at the time. So doing searches to locate the things people had done was very, very challenging. And there are some chapters in the first edition that I was never happy with. I didn't have enough good examples. I couldn't find them. And by this time, there are so many more examples than what I was able to include. It was sort of heartbreaking because I had to exclude so much incredible work, but I just chose to look at it in this very celebratory way, that it's really amazing. And I specifically highlighted the work of graduate students who are doing their theses with arts-based research. That was exciting to me. That was something I couldn't do 20 years ago in the first edition. And so that was sort of the journey of this book. And this cover art, it's actually taken from a much larger artwork, but the piece is by Rebecca Kamen, who might be here today in the chat. I'm hoping she is. She also did the art for the second edition of the handbook, which we'll talk about in a minute. But we were looking through her website. I really wanted to use something of hers. We met at the Salzburg Global Seminar, which was basically the coolest experience of my entire life. So my assistant sent me an email years ago forwarding an invitation. And my assistant said, this is either spam or the coolest invitation you've ever gotten. And in fact, it was the coolest invitation I had ever gotten to spend 5 days in a castle in Austria, all expenses paid. The castle is actually the house that was used to film the exteriors of The Sound of Music. And we stayed there for 5 days, ate in ballrooms, luxurious meals, and it was 50 of us curated from around the world, neuroscientists and artists. So we had musicians like Ben Folds entertaining us and like dancing while he was playing music. And it was a session on neuroscience and art and what are the sources of creativity and innovation. And the bestest friend that I met from that wonderful, incredible experience was Rebecca Kamen. And she's an incredible visual artist. I highly, highly suggest you look up her website just to be inspired. I mean, truly to be inspired. Rebecca wanted to be a scientist when she was young. She was fascinated by science. And she has a learning disorder. She's dyslexic, which she speaks about publicly. And the science path was not going to be the path for her. So she ended up becoming a visual artist. and she works with scientists around the world to create visual representations of scientific phenomena. And her work is just inspiring and unique and incredible. So I wanted to use a piece of work from her book. The publishers didn't want to sort of like use a full piece. They wanted something that was like a little bit more vague and abstract. And so we ended up settling on this, like taking a little piece from one of her pieces and creating the colorful titling because it felt celebratory. And so fast forward, it became time to do a second edition of the Handbook of Arts-Based Research. And I insisted from the outset that if Rebecca would allow us to, we would use a full piece of art because her art is literally about merging art and science. And that is what this handbook celebrates. And that is how we got this incredible cover for the second edition of the Handbook of Arts-Based Research. And she does have a chapter in the handbook. She does not love writing, but I begged her to do it, and she did it, which I am very grateful for. And it includes other pieces of her work, and we'll tell you about this piece, the history of this piece. So you can look all of that up. So really, I just wanted to share this history of how this book came to be. I also want to say that 3 of the contributors from the original handbook, who were all alive when we decided to begin the second edition of the handbook, have since passed away and passed away before the handbook came out. And so the book is dedicated to them, and I pay tribute to them. And it does show you how important the work we do is when we do it and how it lasts, because I've gotten so many messages about their work and their chapters and what it means to other people. And it also makes me know that there might not be a third edition. I don't know. I mean, I have no idea. This could be it. And I thought about that a lot when I was working on this. Like, if this is the last edition of this book, because we just don't know what time brings, what do I want included? And so the biggest change to this handbook from previous editions, I mean, all the chapters are updated, but the biggest change is there are more global perspectives. So I invited people from around the world to write about ABR in their areas. And that is something I could not have done 10 years ago when I was putting the first edition together. I would not have been able to find those people. There are some places in which ABR was not practiced. The second edition of Method Meets Art was the first translated book, the first book at all about ABR ever published in China. So this would not have been possible 10 years ago. And that feels celebratory to me too. And so in closing, I just wanted to say very quickly about my own work. I wrote a chapter about social fiction, so doing fiction as research. And I'm not going to bore you by replicating what's in that chapter. Anyone who's interested can read it. But I do want to read you 2 little excerpts from my novels that speak to today's event. So this is an excerpt from my novel, Hollyland. It is fictional. However, the main character is an arts-based researcher. And so I absolutely drew on all of my research experience. And interestingly, when this book came out, people said it was my most commercial novel, which that's up to people's judgment. However, it is absolutely the novel I put the most research into, which I know because I've written all of them. And the most research is in this one. It's just sort of cleverly disguised in a romance. But I want to read something to you. The main character, her name is Dee. She is an arts-based researcher. She falls in love with a movie star. They are out to dinner with a bunch of his Hollywood friends. And one of them is a film director, and he is very impressed by Dee. He has read her books about arts-based research. He thinks she's amazing. And at this dinner, he asks her why she writes about the arts the way she does. And that is actually me. And it is why I wrote this book and why we have the handbook. So I just like to share it with you. What inspired you to study the arts in the unique way you have? What do you want next? I love the arts, have since I was a little girl. Sitting in a movie theater, going to a concert, reading a novel, it all just seemed magical. Who wouldn't benefit from more magic in their lives? Bride put his arm around her and she nuzzled closer to him. At some point, I realized that for all the arts bring to our lives, they aren't valued. Our education system is proof of that. I had the foolish idea that if I could explain the science of art, explore how people experience art and learn from it, that maybe we'd start to value it more. She stopped and sighed, but truthfully, it's all bullshit. Oliver looked stunned. Why do you say that? Don't misunderstand me. Everything I've researched and written is true. It's just that it shouldn't matter. We should value art for art's sake, but sometimes people can't see what's right in front of them, so you have to give them a way to see it. So that's a little excerpt about why I started on this journey in the first place. And hopefully it also shows you why I write fiction. And I'm going to conclude with reading a little excerpt from my current novel, Shooting Stars Above. Again, my novels are all fictional, but there are always bits of you in your art. And so this is a bit that comes from me. The protagonist in this novel, her name is Tess Lee. She's an author. She writes inspirational novels. She is an aspirational character. She is my hero. So she's not my other side. She is my hero. I love her. But at the end of the book, she does say something that is from me. 100% from me. So she's at NYU, New York University, giving a talk about the importance of literature. And NYU is a school that I've been very lucky to speak at, and I'm actually going to be speaking there in the fall about this book, which is so cool for me. I don't even have words for it. So the things that you create, you can make happen. So this is at the end of her talk. After their conversation about the power of literature, the host invited questions from the audience. The Q&A went smoothly and quickly, and before long, there was only time for one final question. A woman stood up and said, "Your characters are always fighting personal battles, many related to past traumas, but your books have hopeful messages. Do you believe that healing is possible?" I don't think I'm any better equipped to answer that than anyone else in the room. But I will share this from my own experience. When I was in high school, I had a boyfriend who wanted to get married. I didn't feel that way about him and ended the relationship. He told me, "No one will ever be able to fill the hole in your soul." I still remember those words like it happened yesterday. He was hurt and he wanted to hurt me in return. For a long time, those words haunted me like a shadow. Eventually, I realized that we're lucky if we end up with a hole in our soul. You see, our wounds don't start out that way. They're jagged. They have rough edges. They are like flesh that has been ripped from our body. If we learn to let love into our lives, over time, the jagged edges become smooth and only the hole remains. Sometimes that love comes from a friend's laughter, the hug of a child, or the embrace of a lover who sees who we really are. Sometimes giving love freely and with your whole heart can heal you too. When there aren't people to provide that love, it can come from a song or a movie or even a novel. And that is why I write. So thank you all so much for listening and for being here today. I am going to pop into the chat. Guilford has offered a discount code for anybody who's interested in the handbook. It's only good in North America. I'm sorry. I mean, the handbook is available everywhere, but it's only in the US and Canada for the discount from their website because they don't sell them directly abroad. They're sold through a distributor. And I do also want to let people know that I'm teaching a book promotion webinar through the LABRC next month on May 14th. So I'm putting this link up there too for people who might be interested. And with that, I would like to turn it over to my very dear friend and colleague, Jessica Smartt Gullion. She can tell you herself about herself and her work, but she worked in public health. She is a sociologist. She is an incredible ethnographer, and she is a novelist. Jessica?
All right, thank you. Thanks all of you for being here today. Let me pull up my presentation. So my name is Jessica Smartt Gullion. I am a professor of sociology at Texas Women's University. And my chapter in the second edition of Arts-Based Research is about ABR in a variety of disciplines. As I said, I'm a sociologist, and I'm going to focus today specifically on sociology with a nod to other social sciences. One warm May afternoon several years ago, I found myself in a chilly conference room listening to another sociologist, Dr. Patricia Leavy, talk about something she called social fiction. Leavy had recently published her first novel, Low Fat Love, which was based on her extensive research on women and their romantic relationships. She'd conducted a ton of interviews and distilled this theory that women are taught to expect low-fat or unfulfilling relationships with men. But she also believed that full-fat love was possible and available. She told the audience that she had given a lot of thought to who she wanted to hear her ideas. A journal article would have been read by a handful of academics. Of course, as professors, we all need to publish journal articles, but she wanted women in the public to read her ideas, to have a real impact on people's lives. A nonfiction book might catch some attention, but there again, there's a likelihood that the audience might be limited to other academics. While she did not want to lose the academic audience, she wanted to broaden it. A storyteller since childhood, she settled on fiction as mode of representation and wrote her research as a woman's fiction novel. As she told her story, I listened with growing excitement. Could we as academics do this? Like, was this allowed? I raised my hand, nervous, but wanting to talk more with this woman. I'm also a sociologist and a closeted novel writer, I said. The audience chuckled. How did your colleagues respond to the idea of novel as research? Were they supportive? Because my initial thoughts were this was fantastic, but I couldn't imagine some of my colleagues supporting social fiction in my bid for tenure. But her colleagues were supportive, and as you already know, her success with social fiction would go supernova. After the session, I introduced myself, and she told me to stay in touch. And I did, and we ended up becoming the best of friends. Not long after, she published a novel that I'd written and stashed away called October Birds in her social fiction book series. So how did my colleagues react? Well, some of them didn't even notice, and some of them were curious. Two were curious enough to try their hand at writing social fiction themselves. Because all the books in her series are peer-reviewed, it was counted when I went up for tenure. I'd like to step back a bit and talk more generally about research in sociology and what made me nervous about what my colleagues would think. If you go all the way back to the beginnings of the discipline with Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, those thinkers took an inductive approach to their writing. They observed the world, drew conclusions, and wrote about it. Their research was not systematic or rigorous in the way that we would expect today. The Chicago School of Sociology in the US was comprised of ethnographers. They used the city as a natural lab to conduct ethnographic research. Thanks to the University of Chicago Press, they were prolific publishers and shaped a lot of early American sociology. But in the discipline at large, something else was happening. Called the father of the scientific questionnaire, Francis Galton conducted the first large survey research project, as we would recognize them today, in 1870 in the UK. He published his findings in the 1874 volume, English Men of Science, Their Nature and Nurture. Fascinated by the nature-nurture debate raging at the time, Galton administered his survey to hundreds of scientists. His work laid the foundations for survey research and legitimized the questionnaire as a scientific instrument for collecting data about people. Sociology desperately wanted to be seen as a science of society. Even today, the most popular tool for social science research is the questionnaire. Used to collect data on a large number of people to compare across groups and make generalizations about populations, the questionnaire is an ideal tool for gathering superficial information from a lot of people quickly. Researchers craft a list of questions and ask people to choose from a set of pre-crafted responses for each question. The history of the questionnaire provides insight into the motivations of the researchers who developed this method. Early questionnaires, scientifically done research beyond simple accountings and census collections, were developed with the idea that one could evaluate human behavior, construct a predictive model, and then use that information to intentionally restructure society with idealized parameters. Questionnaires as research instruments are linked to the idea of scientific perfection of society. While on the surface this may seem like a noble endeavor, when one steps back to discern what early proponents of the questionnaire meant by scientific perfection, one finds insidious undertones. Galton and the others of his time believed that this tool could be used to reform society into a scientifically mediated utopia. One person's utopia, however, can be another person's dystopia. In 1904, Galton published a paper in the American Journal of Sociology titled Eugenics, Its Definition, Scope, and Aims, in which he argued that society could be improved via selective breeding. Using his survey methodology, Galton believed that sociologists could identify positive traits of human beings. They could then either encourage or discourage specific populations to reproduce and then architect a new society. Galton died before his ideas came to disastrous outcomes. The eugenics movement resulted in mass forced sterilization of millions of people, which continues less explicitly through today. It also led to genocide. Hitler and Nazi Germany believed that eugenics was a brilliant notion, and rather than wait for evolution through breeding to change society, they murdered millions of people. Despite the horrors of the Holocaust, we have then since witnessed additional genocide events: Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, Armenia, Darfur, and so on. And today we are plagued with emergent nationalist groups and the re-emergence of Nazi eugenics propaganda. Now, I do not wish to imply that survey researchers of today support a mission of eugenics. Rather, I want to emphasize that early social scientists had the goal of re-engineering society and that we hold their legacy. Survey research still entails the bureaucratic notion of sorting, generalizing, and attempting to predict behavior. So the questions that I pose for you today are whether or not it is necessary that social sciences be scientific. What other ways scientific could look, and what does it mean when sociologists turn to the arts and humanities? Despite more than a century of survey research, social scientists are still not very good at predicting human behavior. There are many problems survey researchers must contend with, such as bias in question construction, the influence of preconceived outcomes, factors related to the building and administration of questionnaires, ensuring a true random sample, protection against self-selection bias of respondents, the provision of socially acceptable responses to questions, and outright lying. A problem inherent in survey research, as well as in interviews, frankly, is that we expect people to be able to tell us unmediated what they think and why they think the way they do, as if their responses would be unbiased. While researchers are interrogated for bias, the biases of participants is seldom addressed, but should be a significant concern. Statistics perform an erasure, which is enhanced when numbers are used out of context. Too often, numbers essentialize and create reality without troubling or even acknowledging their derivation. When we employ statistical tests, we must remember that we are calculating probabilities. We compute how likely it is that what we believe to be true is true for a population of people at specified confidence intervals. In other words, statistical output numerically represents how confident we are in the likelihood that the computed probability represents reality and did not occur by chance. Early sociologists looked for social laws similar to laws purported to exist by the natural sciences, but social behaviors are not governed by these sorts of universal principles. When the search for social laws proved unfruitful, social scientists turned their attention to causal prediction. While causality is not as deterministic as universal laws, they still believed that causes and effects of social behavior were static and predictable, and that variables, socially ascribed traits that fluctuate from person to person, could be subject to external manipulation. And this continues through today. Through this type of work, social scientists could change society. For example, if we knew the causal variables of juvenile delinquency, we can then address those variables and end the behavior. If we could understand the root cause of poverty, we could eradicate it. Based on this understanding, the job of a social scientist then was to conceptualize, measure, and influence human variables. Present-day positivistic social science is predicated on the search for causal mechanisms with hypothesized linear effects between independent and dependent variables. But what if there are no such variables? What if they don't exist? This has long been a concern for me as a social scientist and methodologist. Social behavior is not reducible to discrete variables. While we do get information from such analysis, I wonder what we're missing. Essentializing social behavior to categorical analysis, to demographic indicators like race and ethnicity, marital status, social class, education, and so on, as if those identity categories tell us all we need to know about a phenomenon when correlated with a series of Likert scale questions, seems overly reductive. The question then becomes, is what we're doing valid, and are there other ways to understand society? Society is complex. When we think about a complex process, you can imagine a spider's web. Pulling on one thread of the web affects all of the other threads. However, the interconnection of all the threads are so complex that we cannot predict in advance precisely how the entirety of the web will respond. Grasping a thread at different points and using different levels of force while pulling will result in different effects on the web that are not directly predictable or proportionate. Small changes in the parameters of a complex system have the potential to produce large effects through the assemblage. This is known in complexity theory as sensitive dependence on initial conditions and has also been called the butterfly effect. Because of this entanglement, we need to account for the entire assemblage and for bifurcations, abrupt changes in the dynamics of the system. Assemblages are not reducible to component parts. So how can you really untangle causal effects when they are so embedded in larger structures? Given this complexity, cause and effect models and interventions don't make a lot of sense. Besides, where should we begin when we discuss cause in a complex system? What is the actual cause of an event? Carl Sagan said, if you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe. When he says from scratch, he means from nothing. He means a time before the world even existed. If you want to make an apple pie from nothing at all, you have to start with the Big Bang and expand the universe. Neutrons, ions, atoms, black holes, suns, moons, ocean tides, the Milky Way, Earth, evolution, dinosaurs, extinction level events, platypuses, Homo erectus, Cro-Magnon man, etc. You need to start at the beginning. You must invent fire. You need water and fertile soil and seeds. You need cows and people to milk them and more people to churn the milk into butter. You need wheat and sugar, cane and apple trees. You need chemistry, biology. For a really good apple pie, you need the arts. For an apple pie that can last generations, you need a printing press and the Industrial Revolution and maybe even a poem. To make such a thing as simple as an apple pie, you have to create a whole new world. So some sociologists are rethinking what sociology should be and how we might do sociological inquiry. Arts-based research is one of those ways. Due to the emphasis on quantitative methods in sociology, as a discipline, it has been slow to embrace ABR. Honestly, I think many sociologists are still skeptical of qualitative research in general, so this is a steep hill to climb. Sociological Methodology, the flagship methodology journal in the discipline published by the American Sociological Association, has yet to engage with ABR at all. In a systematic review of articles published in that journal, I found that none of them discussed ABR or any specific arts-based approach in sociology. Rather, the focus was overwhelmingly on positivistic approaches of quantitative data collection and analysis. The notable exception to this is visual sociology. Visual sociologists typically employ documentary-style photography or video to portray social life. Photo essays are often coupled with quotes from interviews. They occasionally include commentary from the researcher, although commentary tends to be very light on analysis. Visual sociologists also employ photo elicitation or photo voice as method. In these projects, the participants take photographs, which they then share with the researcher. Together, the participant and researcher critically reflect upon the photographs, and in the process, the researcher interviews the participant in depth. The photographs from this type of project are usually exhibited in some format. Another technique used by visual sociologists is to utilize found images, such as images on websites or photography archives. Some sociologists use photographs and visual autoethnography. This presents a unique way of seeing that is particular to the embodied experiences of the author. And of course, I cannot fail to mention social fiction. Some social scientists are moving in that direction. Not only does it appeal to a larger audience, but readers are able to grapple with larger sociological ideas through the story. In my own book, October Birds, I use medical sociology, public health research, and my own experiences as an infectious disease epidemiologist to write about the impact of a hypothetical pandemic influenza outbreak. I wrote and published this before COVID, several years before COVID. During COVID, many people told me that they were surprised at how well I predicted what was going to happen. Yet to me, it made sense because the novel was so research-based. This full discussion lends itself to the problems of social science inquiry, to our practices, to our assumptions, and our assertions. This should not be interpreted to mean that social science has been false or wrong. Rather, my concern is the need to question our processes, procedures, and outcomes to ensure that we're getting at the information we think we're getting. To be sure, the work that has been done to date has told us many important things, and this is not to discount that work or declare it irrelevant. Rather, this is a call to sociologists to explore the contradictions in our approaches and seek alternate ways to do our research. This is a call for us to rethink how we do sociology and to explore new modes of inquiry. Thank you.
That was so interesting. I want apple pie so badly, but now it seems like such a nuisance. So I'm sure we all share that feeling. That was so interesting. Thank you so much, Jessica. And now I want to turn it over to another amazing scholar and one of my dearest friends. She's a communications professor, award-winning, an author, and an incredible, incredible poet. So I'll turn it over to you, Sandra Faulkner.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm usually at a different desk, so I'm like trying to adjust things. So I am delighted that I have a chapter on Poetic Inquiry in the handbook. And so what I want to do is I'm now working on the idea of an Ars Poetic Inquiry. All right. So and like Patricia, I want to talk personally about what poetic inquiry means to me. Because once, this session was up, I thought, well, I really kind of want to reflect on this. And so I am a poet, but I'm also a social scientist. I'm a university professor who teaches and researches about close relationships. I'm a hiker. I'm a feminist ethnographer. I'm a feminist social scientist who uses poetry in my research and community work on close relationships across the life course. And I feel very fortunate that I am able to integrate all of these identities in my personal and work life with and through poetic inquiry. And through that, I actually can bystep the mind-body dialectic. So I began using poetry in my work as a scholar who studies close relationships when I needed to talk about identity and communication in a more nuanced fashion. And I really wanted to describe the physicality and emotionality of doing research. So if this sounds, like the idea of embodiment, right? And I've written poetry since childhood, and I often write poems when I'm trying to make sense of difficult life experiences, right? Cancer, motherhood, aging parents. And shortly after I finished my PhD, which I cannot believe, I think I was figuring that out, it was like 26 years ago. Anyway, I was engaged in a project on LGBTQ Jewish identity, and it was in that project that I started to merge my poetry practice with my social science training, right? And I didn't, at first it kind of seems a bit antithetical, like Jessica, like you were talking about, variables and approaches to research. And I was trained pretty classic, social science. And even my dissertation, which, I look back at it now, was a qualitative piece, but it was, qualitative, way almost on the edge of like quantitative work. And that was pretty radical, right, at Penn State when I was there at the time. But it was through this one project that I started to think about, well, how could I use poetry in my work? And so, what I discovered is that writing poetry helped me to recover from my training in graduate school, and kind of some of the numbing realities of traditional academic writing. It helped me to reclaim my creativity and the rhythm that goes with that. And so poetry let me feel the twists and turns in a research study. I was able to show reflexivity as a feminist scholar. Like I felt that using poetry was a better way to do that. And the bodily experience of doing and being, right, a feminist researcher. Poetry is an excellent vehicle for showing multiple experiences and interpretations. So the actual form of poetry, because it holds so much, right? It's able to be both and. And so I've always appreciated that, right? Poetry is also, I think, utopian in a way in that it can help us shape lives in ways that we want to live. We create and tell stories and advocate for social justice and change. So it's no surprise that when things politically get tough, they always go after, right, the artists, and now we're the scientists, right? And because we can use our art, right, to advocate for social change. It's great for doing embodied work. And yes, poetry has the limitations of language, but it also offers the possibilities of language and poetic forms. And recently in my work, I've been thinking, well, what about other art forms like collage and some visual art and even music? All right, so I've been thinking about how can multiple different kinds of art forms, right, open up our research and some of the possibilities. Goodall talks about the idea that, poetry allows us to hear the tread of another through their experiences, and it compels us to explore a different way of capturing social science research. Poetry is able to position dialectics and demonstrate the fluidity of identities and identity negotiation processes. You don't have to resolve tensions in poetry, right? It can render them in multiple hues and shades and nuances. Poetry, for me, is the language of emotion and possibility. It's a language of rage and joy. Listening to and writing poetry offers new ways of understanding, demonstrations of our limitations and limitless imaginations. And I would argue that it also can be an embodied experience. And I want to share a quote by the late Carl Lego, because Carl Lego was a really big influence. And if anybody, ever had the joy of listening to Carl recite his poetry, there's there's certain just like rhythm and one of the things that I appreciated about Carl was just the joy, like language and words, and he had so much fun with it. But let me share a quote from Carl here. Poetry creates or makes the world in words. Poetry calls attention to itself as a text, as rhetorical device and stratagem. Poetry does not invite readers to consume the text as if it were a husk that contains a pithy truth. Poetry invites us to listen. Poetry is a site for dwelling, for holding up, for stopping. Poetry is about rhythm. Poetry creates textual spaces that invite and create ways of knowing and becoming in the world. Poetry invites interactive responses, intellectual, emotional, spiritual, and aesthetic responses. Poetry invites ways of uniting the heart, mind, imagination, body, and spirit. All right, so no mind mind-body dialectic there. And I believe actually that I have become a better teacher and a better social scientist since using poetic inquiry in my research and my pedagogical practice. And I think that this is the power of poetry, and poetic inquiry can do this for others, right, as well. Yes, I like Carl, right? Just love. I find that poetry makes all of our lives better because of the articulation of the pain, joy, love, and loss in our collective human condition. And it may be difficult for someone to find themselves in their story in a traditional rendering of a research project, but in poetry, people can see themselves and relate. And anyone can write a poem, right? I know sometimes it seems scary, but anyone can. And how many of us have turned to poetry when losing a pet, a lover, a parent, right? I mean, that's usually right what we turn to. And honestly, I was talking about my dissertation earlier. I think the only people that read it were probably the committee. I mean, I know that my parents didn't even, and it's a great dissertation, right? But my poetry, that's something that anyone can engage with. And I have to tell you, it's my poetic, and I still do, more traditional kinds of pieces, but the notes that I got two notes from, some students last week, not at my institution, who were talking about poetic inquiry and my work. And so those are the notes I tend to get. It's about my poetic inquiry. And so, I find that poetry helps me to articulate feelings and thoughts and makes me just kind of a better person all around. And that power is available to anyone. And so poetry in research, right, I have argued, is a way to tap into universality and radical subjectivity. Right? Because oftentimes when we talk about poems, it's like those really specific kinds of concrete details, right, they might have, but then that somehow is able to tap into something universal, right, for folks. The poet uses personal experience and research to create something from the particular, which becomes universal when the audience relates to, embodies, and or experiences the work as if it were their own. So, poetic inquiry is a form of art-based research. It highlights the aesthetics of personal experience, focuses on embodiment and participatory measures, and uses artistic forms to meld scientific and humanistic understandings of relationships. So I see, right? I see poetry right at that intersection, right, of science and art. And so it's right, it's and this is just a definition I've used before, right? The use of poetry that's crafted from our research endeavors, either before you do the project analysis, as a project analysis, and or poetry that you use to constitute an entire project. And so really the key feature of poetic inquiry is the use of poetry as, in, and for inquiry. So poetry uses qualitative research is a method of turning research interviews, transcripts, observations, personal experience, reflections into poems or poetic forms. So when I think about this as a communication scholar, right, scholars have been in communication studies have been using poetic inquiry to study identities, identity negotiation processes, to critique dominant understandings of motherhood, to present relationship processes like breaking up, question the status quo in family communication research, and really to show reflective research practices. So I see it in all of these places. And here's a quote by Kendrick that I like when I'm thinking about poetic inquiry. And so Kendrick states, at its best, poetic inquiry bootstraps comprehension of research topics, energizes inquiry, and challenges how we come to knowledge and what we think we know, undercutting disciplinary discursive norms, right? That's kind of cool. So it can be a needed intervention in our research practices and in our classrooms, right? And again, you can take a both and approach, right, in poetic inquiry, because we need facts and statistics about pressing social problems like sexism and xenophobia, ableism, racism, but we also need the stories and the poetry about the way these feel, right? The concrete details about how it feels to fight against oppressive systems. And art is always a call to action, right? Art gives us the emotional voices to the facts, the individual stories behind the aggregate, the face and name to the theory, the emotional appeal or ethos to the logical findings. And we know that policy is often created from these emotional appeals, right? We like to think that we're logical actors, but we're really not. So this is kind of my celebration of poetic inquiry, right? And as I'm trying to work towards, now I'm like, thinking about an Ars Poetic Inquiry, right? And Ars Poetica, if you know, means the art of poetry. And this is often something that will, give to beginning poets. And it often takes the form of a poem that one writes about the meaning of poetry, how they view it, maybe how they define poetry. And so I was like, well, what if we expand this to think about like an Ars Poetic Inquiry, which to me would be a love letter to poetry and research and what the intersection of these two bring and what their union can be. And so I want to tell you a bit of a story that I think illustrates the way that poetry plays a vital role in my research and my personal life. And when I think about what poetic inquiry means to me as a social scientist, a poet, a relational partner, a teacher, I'm really grateful for how poetic inquiry has allowed me to do research and be in the world as a partner, and these are all slashes, right? Partner, social scientist, feminist ethnographer, educator, social activist. So it's not like I have to, here's the social scientist and here's, right, the relational partner. This is where the hiking part, I did start by saying I'm a hiker. And I find that being in the woods and writing and listening to poetry is very grounding to me. So 5 days ago, I got a call from my younger brother and he's like, you know, mom, she has to have this emergency surgery, which she may or may not make it. By the way, I'm here because she made it. So I just, anyway, and, you know, it was high risk given her age. She's like 86 and her health, she's bedridden. So anyway, I'd like rescheduled, canceled events, you know, everything. Cause I'm like, okay, well, I live in Ohio, right? She lives, here in the Atlanta area, in the US. And so I was like, yeah, I need to be a daughter and drive there. And so it's a very long drive that I don't like doing by myself. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to stop in the mountains because that's the place where I can do thinking, etc. And so I stopped in the mountains, and it's also away from the digital world. There's no cell service, right? There's no, right? And I do feel a little bad. I forgot to call my partner before I went to the woods. I was like, oops, sorry about that. So I went there to hike and camp on the way. Right. And being in the woods really centers me and lets my thoughts have space without the, you know, tedious everyday obligations, roles I have to play. And this is kind of the same experience when I'm writing poetry and like I'm in the flow, right? So I go to the woods and poetry when I need to figure things out. And so I went to the Smokies, and I got to the Smokies around 5 p.m. and I set up my tent. And by the way, so there were thunderstorms the whole way down. So by miraculous, I just think this was great, you know, like from 5 to 8:20, I was able to set up the tent. And I crawled in around 8:20, and then the thunderstorm started and like the lightning. And I was like, huh, I had not tested out this new tent in the rain. So you will be glad to know that the rainfly actually did indeed work. Because I thought, well, we'll see, right? Anyway, so, you know, I took a hike then and was able to the next morning and really thought about my mother and our relationship. And I was really thinking about poetic inquiry too, and what it means, right, as a scholar and an educator. And I really think poetry holds what I can't understand. Poetry builds a world that I can scaffold my ways of being and understanding. By merging understanding and feeling, poetic inquiry creates multiple paths to meanings and worlds that I can live in. And I hope that others, right, can live in. Poetry in the woods are the places and spaces capacious enough to hold the emotions and feelings too loud to share. And so I want to end by just sharing 3 prose poems, right, that are part of a larger project that I created using music and image. But I wanted to share these poems because they're about the mother-daughter relationship across a life course and what happens when things change, right, as they inevitably do. And then, so 1, if the heart is a muscle, then love must be memory. Repeated refrains of the past play across my mother's face and not in her hands. She can't make her fingers grasp a needle or a book anymore, but she can unravel the present into strands of what was. The memories of who we were are wound in a skein of yarn that I muscle up the hill, only to have fall at my feet. My impatience is a boulder that I carry into the eternity of our connection. She directs her dealings from a hospital bed marooned in the family room of memory. This must be love as we perform mother and daughter again and again, memorizing the outcome, willing the present to be somewhere else, trying to replicate the remembered versions of ourselves. 2, grief makes us time travelers. My mother and I take a trip without oxygen masks, incinerate our roles in the fires of aging. We forget to suit up in flame retardant clothing, so we do drills by reflex, stop, drop, and roll, as if falling can extinguish the burn of stolen memories. Mnemosyne turned into a thief and pickpocketed us. Now we don't know what time it is or where the emergency exit is. One of us starts screaming as the other walks through the flames. Who is supposed to do what and when and why? Mother grieves what is. Daughter grieves what was. 3, sundowners. My mother fell down into the past, so the crone took her legs and colored in the white of arthritis. Her limbs branch out and root into a different timeline. All her leaves have fallen off and crumbled into the dust of memory. She can't unetch, undo, and scrape off the lines that spread in crystal shadows across her face, but she can see the secret cats that roam the hallways in the hospital. She wonders why the workers outside can cut grass in a parking lot, how she went to the ER and woke up in her living room. My mother tells the doctor that I'm her wife, Grace, as if a daughter can turn into someone better. Only she can see in this delirium how fog makes the magic in the world manifest. So, Poetic Inquiry is a method for uniting all the selves that you have. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for that wonderful presentation and for sharing those really personal, beautiful, and completely relatable poems, which really illustrated some of the points you were making earlier. And I have to say, before I'm going to introduce our final speaker, you brought up Carl Lago, and so I would like to publicly share a story I have never shared before, very briefly. For those of you who don't know, Carl Lago was an incredible professor and poet and leader in poetic inquiry, and a brilliant, beautiful writer and speaker with an incredible voice. You can watch some of his performances online, and he passed away from illness far too young, which was a huge loss for all of us. Most of you don't know, because I've never shared it publicly, so only a few human beings know that Carl was actually instrumental in getting my social fiction series to become what it became, which is part of the reason that I am sitting here today and have the chapter in the handbook on social fiction. So when I wanted to do a series with an academic publisher that would publish only literary works, novels, novellas, short story collections, plays, poetry collections, and I wanted to call it social fictions. I had just written my debut novel, Low Fat Love. I wanted to publish that as the lead title. You can imagine that, people thought I was crazy. And the first publisher, after a really negative, unpleasant back and forth, ultimately turned it down. Then I went to the second publisher, Sense Publishers, a small indie academic press based in the Netherlands. And they were really interested. The owner, Peter, was really interested, but ultimately turned it down. But I went back to him. I took his no as a maybe, and because I could tell the difference. Sometimes people give you a polite no because they really aren't interested. I think he was actually deeply interested, but he just didn't know how to do it and to make money. So I went back to him. Peter, it turned out, was a playwright, very involved in community theater. I was like, this is my guy. He's a publisher of academic books, but he's a playwright. He's in community theater. And I went back to him and said, you're the right person. Let's make a deal. We ended up making a deal. And the deal was to publish 2 books only, my book, and I got one other book. And then we would see what happened and play it by ear. So I had a contract to publish 2 books, put out a call for proposals, got 100 proposals in the first 24 hours, ultimately got thousands of proposals. I've edited 10 book series. I've never had an experience like that before or since. Thousands of proposals. I had one more slot. And I had sort of promised myself that I would publish something that would not be published if I didn't publish it. It was a commitment I made to myself. And so I turned down some big authors who I knew would make it more successful, but I just didn't feel as good about it because they could get published elsewhere. I also had some amazing novels that were submitted, but I decided since I was publishing a novel, it was important to publish a different art form, a play or poetry, something else to show the larger concept of social fiction. So I was all set. I had picked a play by someone not very known at that time. And I didn't think it would get published otherwise. And right as I was about to submit it to Peter, Carl Lego emailed me his unpublished book manuscript, which of course was freaking gorgeous because he's Carl Lego. And he also is a big name and his books sell. And it wasn't a novel, so it didn't violate this like idea I had in my mind that I shouldn't do 2 novels. So there was, the immediate conundrum. But I emailed him back because I really did feel like he could get published somewhere else, and this playwright might not get her play published elsewhere. So I emailed him back and I said, look, like your book's incredible. I really want it, but I have a deal for only 2 books. So I'm going to think about this, but I want you to know if I don't pick your book, this is why. And he emailed me back immediately. He said, don't pick my book. I can get my book published anywhere. Give someone else a chance. And I said, Carl, hang on a minute. And I emailed Peter, the owner of Sense Publishers. And this is where strategy comes in handy. When I told you it would take strategy to publish Method Meets Art and to make it successful, this is a skill. I share this not about myself so that you might think about this in your own career and your own life. Strategy is important. I emailed Peter, a business person. I said, I've chosen my second book. It's a play. This is what it's called. It's by an author named Diane Conrad. I said, but FYI, Carl Lego sent me his unpublished manuscript, and it's brilliant. If I had 3 books, that would be my 3rd choice. And Peter emailed me back immediately, said, you can have 3 books. And because of Carl, we got 3 books, which quickly became, you can have as many books as you want. And fast forward over the next decade, we published 45 books. Carl was a champion of the series, serving on the advisory board, blurbing my books, offering any help he could. So you brought him up, and it's a beautiful opportunity to pay tribute to a poet and scholar who helped pave the way for so many of us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our final speaker. Roula, is amazing. You all already know this because you're here at the LABRC. What she has done founding the LABRC is something I couldn't even dream of when I first wrote Method Meets Art 20 years ago, that there would be a center putting on this kind of event and all the kinds of in-person and virtual events, connecting all of us from around the world, being here in these moments of collective struggle so that we can celebrate and learn from the arts. I could not even have imagined that. When I was telling my husband, when I first met Roula online, I was telling my husband, Mark, about her, and he said, well, what's she like? I said, honestly, she's like me, but she's better. And I think that's true. She is amazing. People have been very generous at times to call me the queen of ABR, but the crown is off because I happily hand it over to Roula, who is truly the queen of ABR, to whom we all owe a major debt. And so with that, we are looking forward to anything you want to say.
Patricia, thank you so much. I have never been as embarrassed in my entire life. I mean, you are incredible, all of you, the 3 of you. I mean, there's just so much inspiration to get from you all, and it's I don't know what to say. I mean, after this introduction, I really do not deserve any of that, Patricia. And just a fun story, like when I first met Patricia online, I thought it was some joke. I thought, those bots, those fake accounts, like she cannot be speaking to me. Like I'm sure it's not the real person. And then when I asked her for her email, she sent me an email that I had copied wrong. And then when I sent the email to that address and it bounced back, I was like, so that is not Patricia Leavy. So my feelings were in the right place. Somebody is trying to play some really cool practical joke on me. But then Patricia speaks to me again and I say, well, you know what? I sent you an email and it bounced back. So I don't think this email is real. And then Patricia says, well, did you put this number in the email? I'm like, no. She said, well, my email is this. And then I look at it again and I look at the one that I had sent to, and yes, there was 1 character missing. So anyway, I was like, well, maybe she is real and maybe she is contacting me. And this has been one of the best things that has ever happened to me. And Patricia, I am so honored to be with you all today, to get to know you, and contributing in the Handbook of Arts-Based Research, I think is, again, one of the biggest honors I've ever had. So I'm very excited to share with you the heart and spirit behind the chapter in this book, which Patricia made me write twice. And I say twice because the first time was like, me, like the LABRC had only been 1 year old, and Patricia wanted me to speak about some of the stuff that we've been doing and, the future plans. And I'm like, well, are you sure? Like, we're just one. And thank you, Patricia, for believing in me. And then I think it was 3 or 4 days before I was due to submit the chapter. I was working on it. I think it was around 2 or 3 a.m. And then I save it. But you know how you get those dialogue boxes and you're too tired to actually see what they're asking you, and then you click OK, and then all of a sudden, life is ruined. Well, that's what happened. It asked me something like whether I was sure I wanted to save it. And what happened is I saved a corrupt version. I mean, I don't know what, but something happened. And then the next day, when I came back to the file, I found just 1 page out of, I think it was 17 back then. I was heartbroken. I didn't know how to break it to Patricia, how to tell her that, I can't be submitting anymore. And at the time, I was starting to have something like cubital tunnel syndrome and carpal tunnel, maybe a mix of both. And I was doing all types of MRIs and therapies and stuff just to see what's going on. Typing was extremely difficult. But Patricia was like, you can do it. Take another month and you can do it. Don't worry. I did it thanks to Patricia. And for anyone with a copy of this lovely second edition of the handbook, you've probably seen the chapter, and it's titled The London Arts-Based Research Center, The Creative Psyche as Knowledge Generator. So for those of you who don't know me, I am a Jungian and literary researcher. I tend to combine Jungian theory with literature. I'm an editor of Indelible, which, here it is. So this is the LABRC's literary journal, which I will speak a bit more about very soon. I'm a writer. I was a university professor for 13 years. I'm a fangirl of all great writers like Patricia and Sandra and so many great people here. And before anything else, my creative side is poetry. So I am a poet. I believe that poetry is a state of mind. It's a state of being human that we all need to be more in touch with, because we are all, there's a poet in all of us. We just need to get more in touch with that side, give it some free rein whenever it asks for it. And I also believe that poetry is most importantly a solution, because like Sandra just said, I believe that it is a whole world of emotion, possibility, connection, communication, and I also find it to be a spiritual experience as well. So it's my comfort zone, my favorite way of, my favorite method for understanding the self, for understanding others, for trying to understand the world and all the ineffable things that we feel and see. It's an exercise in empathy and connection with each other, which makes it much needed in our world today with all the siloing and the partitioning that is going on. We need more of it in the workplace. We need more of it in social circles, in dealing with multiple crises, and of course, in dealing with the different voices within. So as Virginia Woolf, if she was still alive today, she would be my neighbor now because I live just a couple of streets down where she lived. We are not one and simple. We are many and complex. So yeah, I believe that. And I believe that poetry helps us get in touch with all those complexities within. And yes, as Sandra said a few minutes ago, it has the power to shape our lives and to make things happen, or, to shape the ways that we want to live. So this chapter is a little bit about everything, the poetic inquiry that we do and all the other stuff that goes on in the LABRC, our ethos, our backstory. So it speaks about the LABRC's origins that are deeply rooted in connection and imagination, and of course, scholarship. So it's all that together. And it actually started around poetry during times of crisis. Accidentally, if you want to call it synchronistically, but it led to the birth of a beautiful global community that helped us to realize how small and yet how big and expansive the world is with all of its possibilities. So it first took shape through Indelible, which is, again, here it is, our literary and arts journal, which during COVID led to the birth of Indelible Evenings, which is a series of online events that flourished during COVID, during lockdown. So when people were at home, feeling isolated, we were communicating with each other through Indelible by reading poetry, sharing stories, sharing art. And a few months into Indelible Evenings, we felt, well, why don't we have Psych Creative, which is another digital salon. Psych Creative was born, and it is a monthly series combining Jungian or depth psychology with creativity, also opening the door to some profound discussions around arts-based research long before many of us had heard of them. And what became clear very early on was that creativity and knowledge making were not separate domains. This was a topic that kept popping up. And actually, in our very first Psych Creative session, Professor Susan Rowland was our first guest speaker, and she opened the series with a talk about arts-based research and the previous edition of the Handbook of Arts-Based Research. So arts-based research became, the term that we used from that time onwards, thanks to Susan and, of course, the handbook and its lovely editor and contributors. So, yeah, and then we started finding each other. So there were scientists, doctors, lawyers, poets, writers, artists, all came together, and through their shared practices and creativity, we found ourselves blurring those artificial lines between the sciences and the arts. And as Patricia puts it, there's this natural affinity between artistic practice and research practice. And at the LABRC, we fully embody and embrace that marriage between the two. So the chapter explores how arts-based research frames creativity itself as a research method, whether through active imagination. So we do bring in a bit of the Jungian elements here, hence the active imagination, poetic inquiry, collaborative engagement. So all that, the LABRC champions the creative psyche as a dynamic generator of knowledge. We believe that making art is doing the research. So Susan Rowland always says that doing the art is doing the research. And that the creative act brings the unconscious into conversation with the conscious mind, producing new ways of seeing the world. So the chapter also contains a reflection on how we draw inspiration from Jungian ideas and, of course, the ideas in Patricia's writings. And, adding in the Jungian elements of focusing on symbols, on active imagination and archetypal images, and how we also engage with the work of scholars like Susan and Patricia, who emphasize the need for transdisciplinarity, diversity, and also the breaking down of hierarchies between disciplines and the arts. So a crucial intellectual inspiration, of course, here, as we just mentioned, is Susan Rowland. Her work, particularly on creative research as a response to crisis, her theories of depth psychological inquiry, and her emphasis on the imaginal, and how it greatly shaped the ethos of the LABRC. She challenges traditional academic frameworks by proposing that we cannot solve modern crises, whether ecological, cultural, or psychological, through rational methods alone. insisting that it is the creative psyche working through mythology, through art, and through the imagination that could actually offer new ways of thinking and being. So, yeah, we believe that arts-based research is not a marginal practice, but an essential methodology for reanimating knowledge itself and also the modes of gaining knowledge. And of course, the deep inspiration, Patricia Leavy's call for transdisciplinarity here is a force majeure in the LABRC. So the idea that research should move beyond fixed disciplinary borders and that collaboration across fields can give birth to new transformative forms of knowledge, and how scholarship and creativity should go hand in hand. So what we do here is we seek to create spaces. So we have a lot of spaces for so many different categories. Not that we categorize things because they sort of melt into each other at the end of the day. So, but mainly these spaces are where you've got the imaginal and the intellectual, the embodied and the theoretical together, the scientific and the artistic, of course. All those binaries are blurred and everything is honored equally. There's a lot of encouragement of thinking through materials, whether the material you're using are words, paintbrushes, clay, so what have you. Creating as a method for knowing, and storytelling and poetry as inquiry. So the LABRC, as many of you know, runs conferences, workshops, courses that put these ideas into practice. So different ways, whether through active imagination, poetic inquiry, the visual arts, performative writing, the LABRC's work, which is everybody's work. It nurtures this global community that wants to see creativity not just as a mode of expression, but also as a method of discovery, of healing, and of connection. So, yeah, we do a lot of merging disciplines, connecting people, merging ways of knowing, and nurturing a vision of research and art as two sides of the same essential human longing for understanding, for meaning, and for transformation. Because as Patricia mentioned at the very beginning of this session, the arts are being fought against at the time when we need them the most. So the best thing that we can do right now, besides being true to ourselves, and the best way to do that even is through creating. So to keep creating, to keep learning through creating, and to blurring any of those artificial boundaries and chasms between knowledge or scientific knowledge versus the creative modes of knowledge. Yeah, and so Patricia said to you earlier, and I'm going to repeat this, Patricia will be giving a webinar on the 14th, and she'll also be giving a masterclass on creating your own story world, and that will be in Oxford on the 26th of May. We also have an amazing workshop by Sandra on the 5th and the 12th of May on writing poetry from family stories. So we would also like to invite everybody to engage in these lovely events. And Indelible, well, if you look at the website, the deadline for submission, so the windows were supposed to close after 2 days on Wednesday. But the good news is we'll be extending it for 1 more month. So if you've got poetry, stories, whether fiction or nonfiction, art, visual art, painting, photography. So if you would like to submit it, you're most welcome to do so. And the theme is awakening. So yeah, with that, I think I've pretty much tried to summarize some of the things that I wrote about in the chapter. Yeah, and maybe I'd like to finish off with a poem too. So if you would like to hear that. So this collection was a COVID baby. Lockdown baby, actually. So this is when poetry was a way of expanding space and the world. And also memory, we found ourselves walking down memory lane during lockdown, thinking of loved ones, thinking of better days, thinking of when we're going to meet them again, or the times that we will never get back to again. And well, this poem here, we also did a lot of cooking. So again, this is usually a forgotten art, but I also find cooking to be an incredible arts-based research method that needs a lot more attention, especially when you bring it into poetry. It's called To Savor and Relish, and it is inspired by the foods, my grandmother's foods, that I found myself cooking over and over again during lockdown. So, whether it's lazy cake, banana bread, custard, marble bunt, or a savory salted log of fries, when their airy little fairy whiffs channel my inner Peter Pan, they jump into that black hole where all is lost in translation, right beneath the shaded grove of the cerebral cortex. Into that storage room of scenes they pry, rummaging through childhood memories, while dallying with my emotional thermostat. In retro scrying, I see myself with friends and siblings, commencing the weekend around a Monopoly board on a cozy Friday post-school afternoon, propped on a carpet bedecked with an audience of curious crumbs and candy wraps. I see my grandmother busy with life, filling up cupfuls of sweet cinnamon joy, as she hums love, an acoustic match to the olfactory heaven she creates. Some days we were scolded for staying out in the rain. Those were made of bittersweet chocolate. There were mornings when we bit into an icy winter day as our teeth guided the way through the warm oregano pastry. And those birthday parties, when cake was everything and life was one big vanilla puff, and blowing out candles was not an evil act of spreading germs. We held brunches on the terrace when the weather allowed a Sunday to live up to its name. And those nights when Grandma arrived, wrapped up in cloaks and shawls as she brings us a warm thermos of lentil soup, which, like her, remains warm and temperate despite the frigid world. It's these images and aromas of winter that keep us snug. Despite the cold, we kept warm. And today, when we're feeling gelid again, we still reach out for these smells that lead those walks down memory lane and defrost through poetry. Cronus is a professional abductor, but cake pays a handsome ransom. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for the inspiration and for being here and for making all this happen. I mean, the real backstory of the LABRC, the real backbone is all those amazing people who brought their creations and their ideas and their thoughts and the meaningful discussions to the table and made all that happen. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Roula. Thank you for this incredible, incredible space that you have created and sharing the behind the scenes and the presentation and that beautiful, beautiful poem that, again, like what Sandra said, we can all relate to, even though it has details specific to you and your family, there's something so universal about it as well. So thank you. And thank you for showing the power of the arts. There's a reason they come after the artists. There's a reason they come after the educators. There's a reason they come after the creatives and the thinkers. This happens over and over again. History shows us there are reasons. What we do is powerful. And just the connection of all of us being here today in different places and those who will choose to watch it later, there is power in that. I heard an amazing talk that Tori Amos, who is a singer and musician who I admire very much and have been very fortunate to meet many times. She just had a children's book come out recently and she was doing a book tour, and I didn't go to any of the events, but I watched one of them online. And she was talking about what it's like being on a book tour at this moment in the United States, talking to people who are afraid about free speech, freedom of expression, of losing their jobs, losing their funding. She was talking about that, and she was like, look, you can't fire the fairies. You can't fire the fucking fairies. And what she really meant is you can't fire inspiration. You can't get rid of that spark. You can't kill inspiration. There's nothing you can do. It lives within each of us. And so I really feel like in all times, but especially in this time, we need to ignite that spark within, and we need to create, and connect. So I'm extremely grateful to Roula and to all of you for the space of the LABRC as such an important space for both inspiration and connection. And with that, I would just like to turn it over to everyone for discussion, celebration, comments, questions for any of the presenters. I don't know if she's still here, but I did see that because your images are like floating by. But I did see that Rebecca Kamen was here. So hopefully she still is. She made this incredible cover art that I shared with all of you. So with that, maybe Roula, you and Sarah can look at some of the comments and field questions from people.
Right. Well, there are many comments. Let me just start at the very top. Lots of hellos from different parts of the world. And if anybody in the meantime would like to just jump in and use the mic, please feel free to do that. We've got a comment from Gio, who's joining us from Vancouver. I find it interesting that Dr. Levy's chronology of this latest milestone echoes an appreciable part of the, why can't I see what this word is? Sorry, something. Right, oh, the ABR literature as I see it. Brava, and thanks for all of your wonderful work and the grace with which you always share it.
Very kind. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you could make it here today. I have zoomed into his courses. We've never met in person, but I've zoomed into his classes to talk about ABR many times, and it's always a huge treat. He always writes like an introductory poem to introduce me, which is so cool. But this is what ABR does, right? It gets the coolest people together just to try and be creative, just to try stuff out. Sometimes, all different kinds of things. And I think that's an amazing thing, and something that we should never lose.
So thank you, Gio. And we also have a comment from Aaron Hoy, a fellow sociologist here. I'd say much the same, sadly. So Aaron is agreeing to what you said. And we've also got, well, some people have had to leave early because of work. But again, those of you, if you're watching the recording, we want to thank you again for making it into your schedule. That is so amazing of you. Sally has got a hand up. So Sally, please feel free to jump in.
Hi all, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, I've really enjoyed that tonight, even though we've just had a conference and I'm knackered. But we had a clowning company come and do something called Good Grief. And I have to say, it was just amazing. And one of the things that the lead of the company was, this is political, she was saying how political really clowning is, was that a lot of the invitations they get are from privately funded schools in this country because they've got the money for the arts, and when it's being decimated everywhere else. And she was saying they're kind of learning the art of, and what I felt she was saying was like buffoonery. She didn't use that word, but I mean, you saw that thing with Trump on the, with the, speaking about the Pope, and then stood beside him this Easter bunny. And I just think, yeah, there's something, for me, there was something clever going on. And she was really exploring that. But I have to say, it was just an amazing 2 hours that we had as a group. And we all want to now do a clowning retreat. Yeah, really, Patricia, you need to get in touch. I think they need to go in the book.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's so good to see you. And that sounds so cool. I'm on board. I mean, I'll don the red nose, I'll wear the squeaky shoes, whatever. I'm on board.
She did a really interesting thing. She said what clowning kind of was and wasn't, and she used Fleabag. Have you watched Fleabag, where they break the kind of fourth wall so that you talk directly? There was something really fab about it. Yeah, anyway, I could go on about it and I won't.
That's incredible, Sally. I mean, we had a conference in February, an online conference on the function of humor, and you're just running a lot of ideas through my mind right now. So, yeah, clowning is definitely something we'd like to look into, probably for next year's Function of Humor conference. Thanks.
I'll share the details, Roula.
Oh, please do. Yes. Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. And Ray, hello, Ray.
Hello. Thank you very much for 4 great presentations today. I have rather a long comment because as I'm listening to all of them, I'm trying somehow to put it into a wider context of things that I've been interested in for a long time. And it seems to me that the wider context for me is that creativity and not rationality is the center of human consciousness, which I'll get back to. But seemingly each of you have moved towards art as a more holistic or comprehensive expression of human consciousness, whereas seemingly academic scholarship, although it's important and adequate, doesn't have the reach that art has. Or academic scholarship or rational understanding doesn't have the reach of artistic understanding. And so I'm thinking of the presentations today all in terms of the work of Ian McGilchrist and his work with right hemisphere and left hemisphere. And it seems like the arts-based research is moving towards an understanding of the right hemisphere as being the dominant one and the left hemisphere more academic, rational, being not less important, but not of leading importance. Yet in the modern world, often the left hemisphere is considered to be of leading importance. So, oh goodness, right in the middle of this, I've got to stop. I'll come back. Somebody's at the door. I apologize.
All right. Thank you, Ray. We will read a couple of comments while Ray comes back. So Garnet says, poets find poetry, poetry finds poets. And that's a lovely quote by Garnet from Garnet. Thank you so much for sharing it. And Noelle says, what a lovely way to spend time on a Monday. Thank you all so much for sharing. Thank you, Noelle, for joining us.
Roula, I see a comment
Yes.
from Rebecca Heyman, who made the cover art, that she'd be
Yes.
happy to talk about the artwork. So can we turn it over to her for a minute if she's—
Please,
Rebecca,
yes,
I hope you're
absolutely.
still here. I'm just seeing the comment.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you for organizing this. I'm sort of new to this. I'm more old school and talk about life-changing events. The Salzburg seminar was just a huge transformational event for me, and it put me in touch with Patricia, and it's just been quite extraordinary. What I would like to mention about the piece that was selected, well, first of all, I was full of gratitude and honored that you wanted to put this installation on the cover. This particular installation is called Portal. And a lot of it was generated by research working with astrophysicists. And my practice has always been about seeing the poetry in science. And I've been very blessed in terms of having been a college professor for a long time and also living this other life of being a conduit between art and science. But this particular piece And I think the title is very appropriate for what we're talking about. It's about how black holes are portals. The piece is also about a dialogue between astronomical time and geological time. And so time again becomes another construct in which this particular sculpture installation is about. And what I try to do with my work is to take things that are very ethereal and very constructs that are very far away and create an experience for people to reimagine what they think their relationship is to this. And it seems like the perfect metaphor to put on the cover of this book, because everything that all of you do in your collective fields of creating new bridges using research is really what that sculpture is about. So thank you all for allowing me to be part of your journeys. I retired from college teaching in 2013 because this art science work started taking off. And this has been such an inspiring afternoon for me. You have no idea, because most of my time is either spent with scientists or reading scientific research, but this has been so grounding. And poetry and sound is something that I integrate with my work. And even though I'm not a poet, I've been blessed to work with incredible poets from all over the world who help me use my work to create these just extraordinary bridges in the same way you do with your work. So thank you all for letting me be part of your journey and allowing me to share my journey with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. So I'm so excited that you're here today. And I just have to tell everyone, it's probably already obvious because you just heard her talk about her work, but Rebecca is literally one of the coolest, most inspiring, creative people I've ever met in my life, which leads to truly, for those of you who have read my novel, Spark, Peyton's best friend, Ronnie in Spark, was inspired by Rebecca. My best friend at the Salzburg Global Seminar. So she is just a huge, huge inspiration to me. And we've just stayed connected, and we met at a conference and went out with our spouses. But we've continued to collaborate as we've collaborated with others. But what I really wanted to say, and Rebecca has reminded me of it, is that really the greatest thing that arts-based research has brought me, starting more than 20 years ago with the journey toward the first edition of Method Meets Art, is connecting me with incredible, creative, brilliant, inspiring, intelligent people around the world who I would never otherwise be connected with. I always say that what Method Meets Art really did for me, and then ultimately what the handbook really did for me, is those books went around the world and they took me with them. And that has been the gift of my life. And I would also say, because there might be other contributors here or who watch this later, I have edited a lot of books in my career. And editing books is actually a nightmare. Anyone who tells you otherwise is either a liar or they had some uniquely amazing experience. But editing books is hard, hard work. Corralling a whole bunch of people and keeping on top of everyone and getting everything in on time and curating it. It really is. It's a lot easier for me to write a book than to edit a book. Writing a book, I can do myself. Easy peasy, no problem. Editing a book, oh my goodness, many years, a lot of work goes into it. This represents the labor, not just of the contributors, of a huge publishing team, of my assistant, of many, many people who had to make this happen. But I will say, and this is the truth, the Handbook of Arts-Based Research, both editions, was the easiest book to edit in my entire career, because arts-based researchers are awesome. They are the coolest people and they care about the field. So egos go aside and they want to contribute. Like Rebecca said, she was grateful and humble to have her art on the cover, whereas we were thrilled and honored and delighted to have her art on the cover. But it was really the same with all the contributors. It's the only handbook I've ever edited, and I've edited many, where everyone I emailed was like, they wanted to do it and they were enthusiastic and they came through, and it's just, that's the world of arts-based research. That's the world that Roula has tapped into with the LABRC. It's the world we're all a part of. So I'm going to turn it over to Roula. So if there's one final comment or question while we have a couple of minutes left, I am mindful of everyone's time. But those will be my last words, because that is what I wanted to say. And Rebecca being here is just a shining example. So thank you, Rebecca. I'm so happy to see you. And thank you for this incredible art that everybody comments on. And I will say I've been lucky to see a lot of Rebecca's art in person, including my husband and I were randomly in Washington, D.C. when she had an incredible exhibit there at a university, as she always has incredible exhibits everywhere. And we went, and that exhibit was of the coronavirus. And she took something that was so scary to so many of us and turned it into this really beautiful, mesmerizing, fascinating exhibit of beautiful artworks with a soundscape. So it's an entire like visceral experience. So I do suggest you all look at her website just to be inspired, just to see her incredible work. So Roula, I'll turn it over to you for one final whatever.
Thank you, Patricia. And I just want to echo what you said about Rebecca's work. Rebecca, when Patricia showed me the cover of the handbook, the second edition, like the first thing I noticed, of course, was your art. And synchronistically, that was during our Science and Sensibility conference. So that was very ambient and very reflective of what we were doing then. So thank you. I mean, that's really, it's a real treat to get to know your work, which is incredible. And I also popped in the chat box the link to our Science and Sensibility issue of Indelible, which was the issue before this one. There's a lot of poetry inspired by black holes, the coronavirus, you name it, that issue has it. So, there's just so much to bridge between science and the arts. I just wanted to check if Ray wanted to, if there was anything else you wanted to add, Ray, before we close.
Oh,
I know you had to leave briefly.
I always have something more to say, but I just wanted to make comments on a couple of things that struck me. Sandra said poetry holds what I can't understand, and that made me think of how art basically holds what rationality or the self holds what the ego doesn't understand. Poetic inquiry is a method for uniting all the self you have. And that to me was a key comment as well, because in my own way of thinking, creativity is the center of consciousness. And it's only through creativity that you can bring everything together. Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. And the mantra I like to use is we create, therefore we become. And then Roula said creativity and knowledge are not separate domains. It's the whole idea of being more inclusive. Just a suggestion, I also attend sessions of what's called the Pari Center in Italy, P-A-R-I, and it's a group of scientists who are very interested in changing the paradigm, and that is that consciousness is not an emergent property of matter, but matter is an emergent property of consciousness. So these are world-leading scientists that are changing the paradigm. And that's what I was trying to say with your presentations today. I see it as a part of a larger change that might be happening slowly, but I think it's a very important change, moving psychologically from ego to self, as Jung would say. Thank you. Sorry, I had to be interrupted there.
Well, thank you so much, Ray. And by the way, Ray is an incredible poet. Ray and everybody who's here today, it's a huge honor for us to witness this huge change that, as Ray mentioned, that seems to be happening, maybe slowly, maybe there will be a tipping point sometime soon, but yes, this whole paradigm shift that we are all witnessing at a global, maybe universal scale, if you want to call it. Thank you for your comment, Ray, and thank you everybody else for all what you're doing, for just showing up, for being here. And thank you so much, Jessica, Patricia, and Sandra, for the wonderful session today and for your incredible work as ever. So we do hope to see you all again very soon. The LABRC does a lot of free events, so we have 2 free events like this one every month. We've actually got one on Wednesday, so it's about an AI of philosophy. So if you're curious to know more about it, just like me, then you might want to jump in. It's a free event. It's also at 7 p.m. London time, and we'd love to have you there. Yeah, and have a great evening or morning or afternoon, wherever you are, and a lovely week ahead. It's a great way to start the week. So thank you, Patricia,
Thank you
Jessica,
so
and
much,
Sandra.
Roula. Thank you, Jessica and Sandra and Rebecca and everybody who came. Wonderful to see you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.